Arena citations and 3 Naval Achievement Medals. He's got a lot of experience with that. And essentially, Jason can tell me if I'm wrong, but essentially his firm assists hospitals, healthcare organizations with quality and safety issues, evidence-based medicine, nursing administration, operating room efficiency, regulatory issues, mostly around the perioperative area, so the operating room and all the things that come with the operating room, like pre-op and post-op and so forth. So with that as a background, did I get it mostly right, Jason?
Pretty darn close, yes.
All right, excellent. I hope I did you justice. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to stop sharing. And I unfortunately forgot to press record for that beautiful introduction, but I'm going to press it right now. So
recording in progress.
Anyway, I'm going to turn it right over to Jason Goodwin, and I'll stop sharing so you can take over. Thank you so much.
Sounds good. Yeah, it's my pleasure, everybody. So, man, are you guys lucky tonight, because I'm about to nerd out on you guys. All right, this is my favorite subject in the whole world to talk about. So, David, how do I share my screen here?
You should be able to see it down below on share screen. It should be open to everyone.
Okay, let me take a look.
On the controls down below, or it depends on your layout. It might be at the top too.
Got it.
And then we'll guide you through and help make sure that you're on the right screen and so forth.
Okay, so let me just get myself straightened out with my PowerPoints. All right, and I think I'm good to go. How's the sound, everybody? Is that all right?
Yeah, the sound is beautiful. We can hear you perfectly. Oh, there come your slides. Perfect.
Great. All right, let me just make sure that I have what I need. There we go. All right, rock and roll. All right, everybody, let me get one last little tweak so I can see your faces while I'm talking. It makes it a little bit more personal. Forgive me if I'm looking off to the left occasionally. I'm just looking at my screen, and feel free at any point if we have some opportunities to ask questions. All right. But thank you for allowing me to talk to you today. So as I hope it's okay if I call you David. I'm not used to calling you anything else, but
yeah, no, I'm a doctor by license only at this point, so you can call me whatever you want.
I'm sure they're aware you have a first name. So yes, David. So David asked me to come talk to you about the operating room. So my background from the war when I was in the military was perioperative services, and I never left. And with the exception of some teaching nursing in Northern California to some other areas as well, I never wanted to do anything else. So we're going to talk about operating rooms A to Z. Okay, soup to nuts. If there's anything that you have questions on, feel free to ask, but I wouldn't be surprised if you learn more tonight about the OR than you ever wanted to. All right, so a little bit of history on the OR. So on the left-hand side, there's been a lot of changes, right? So from the time when Louis Pasteur invented, the idea that there was infection hundreds of years ago, to the time when we started doing open surgeries on people, to the time when we started doing laparoscopic surgeries. And so you here have a picture of an open surgery on your left, and what the way that is typically done with the retractors opening up the belly. And then you have in the middle there something that came along in the 80s, and people learned to do surgery sort of with chopsticks, right? And it's an amazing technology, but it's very different than the surgery that's open. So it's sort of like relearning that skill. And now you even see, and I'm sure you've all heard of robotic surgery, and there's many products out there that are helping surgeons with that learning curve as well. So there's huge opportunities in all three of those technologies, but we're moving pretty fast in American healthcare through technology. But along the way, we've had changes in the way hospitals are paid and reimbursement. We've taken patients from staying as long as it needs to a patient that goes home as soon as it's safe. We have changed practice models. We've taken in things like HMOs that have changed the way healthcare is delivered. Government oversight has changed and seemingly continued to become larger. Price transparency has come in so that people start to play more of a shared understanding of what they're paying. And patient satisfaction, of course, is something that we're all concerned about. And now you might hear, even if you're not in the arena, staffing and burnout is a big problem. And so you'll hear about that over the next 5 to 10 years. There's going to be staffing crises in healthcare, and so it won't be something that is a secret to you. And if you're unfortunately unlucky enough to have to get care, there might be some issues with access and things like that. So that's never a good thing. That's something that, as an operating room manager or director, we work on constantly in different ways to make sure that people have access to the ORs. And when I was managing ORs, that's what I would always approach the problem with is when you're trying to fix an OR, you're trying to run an efficient OR, it really all boils down to the fact that at the end of the day, if you do it more efficiently, there's more people that are going to be able to get into that OR. And there's always people waiting. So it's all about your access. Okay, so we're going to start this long road with talking about scheduling. Okay, anybody ever been to surgery? Yeah, me. You probably got wound up and you talked to your surgeon, and then pretty short after that, you started talking about when you're going to do it, right? And so that's the scheduling process. And so scheduling's come a long way too, just like surgery. So you see on the left-hand upper side, that's the way the schedules used to look. And then, we tried to go paperless and go over to what's more like a computerized system, although before a lot of these true computerized systems came, it was sort of like a gap that we essentially just moved to computer software, but it was still hand inputted. And so it wasn't true automation and true electronic organization. But now we've gotten to more of that with the electronic health record, and Kaiser was one of the big facilities to implement that early, and pretty much 80% of the market has implemented that, and then the other 20 or so have implemented Cerner, and so they're all electronic records. And in the future, everybody talks about our artificial intelligence. At this point, there's some application for that, but I'm in a conference in Chicago, and I was just speaking with a couple other administrators today in a roundtable, and their point was, and I believe this too, is we're at the skepticism phase with AI, right? People have been talking about predictive analytics for a long time, and what that sometimes ends up just being is historical trending. Healthcare has been notoriously behind the eight ball as far as dedicating resources to that. Kind of in the way, like I tell people, we don't have any, at least we didn't for a long time, have any infrastructure for those types of improvements compared to an organization like Target, right? Now, Target can tell you exactly when an item is pulled off the shelf, when it's scanned, and it will order it automatically so that it's there the next morning. And so I would often hit my head against the wall and say, why can't we do it? Well, that's because it was critical to Target's plan, right? And, organizing the operating rooms, efficiencies, supply chain management just wasn't our biggest concern until recently. So we're learning and we're taking our lumps, but we're coming along as we're doing it. So when you get scheduled, here's the way an operating room works. So there's a couple different ways to do it. First come, first served. So the low volume surgeons who schedule the cases a few per week, they sort of fall in whenever they can get in, right? And so they don't really have a prioritized access. But the ones that have a larger volume, they get blocked access. So they have a certain room, they have a certain day, they may even have a certain allocated staff member. Those are high volume surgeons, and if they don't fill that block within a period of time, then they call that a release time, and so that's released. And so that becomes an open time, which is sort of the first selection that I told you about. That widens open the OR. It opens up for anybody who's waiting. And depending on if you're an outpatient facility where you're not getting emergency room visits and things like that, or if you're an inpatient hospital, that add-on, that's called an add-on, that population can be very important to your running your OR, right? You have to make room for them. You can't just run elective procedures when somebody needs a heart transplant, right? And so you have to manage that and at the same time be as efficient as possible while safeguarding everybody's safety and quality. So we have add-on cases, and then, as I said, there's the emergency that has to be taken seriously. So a little bit of information on the block schedule. So here's an example of a level 1 trauma facility that was a prior that I was a former director of, and I actually cut off part of the block schedule to make it more visual. But there were 34 operating rooms, and so we had 34 blocks, and it was very complicated, right? And because it's a level 1 trauma facility, we have to have immediate access to a trauma room at all times. And so you would hold a room, and that's not a very common thing to do in an operating room. We don't hold ORs open. But with very few exceptions, trauma being one of them, that's what we would do. But as you can see, there's every service here. There's orthopedics, there's oncology, GI, transplant, and so every one of these has an allocation. Now, as the surgical services director, you have data on this, right? So I know every service what their utilization is. I know if they're missing some of their targets, and we readjust those monthly or quarterly depending on how they're achieving. And so this is a very controversial and not popular process because the surgeons have their schedule disrupted if they don't achieve a certain amount of utilization, right? And in all fairness, it is actually a very intrusive thing to do to a surgeon because it affects their clinical schedule as well, right? So even in the surgeon lives two lives, right? They live in the clinic and they live in the OR. As an OR director, I manage the sandbox that they live in, but they have an entirely different life in their clinic. And so to change those access points disrupts their clinic as well, which is why it's often underutilized to reallocate blocks, which creates problems. It creates inefficiencies for the OR. Okay, so
quick question.
Yes, sir.
Do you still call those held? I use the term red rooms for the held rooms. Is that a pretty common term?
Yeah, red rooms. We do. Different people call them different things. I've heard people call red rooms, and then they have blue rooms, and all sorts of. But the red rooms. Let me see if I can remember what that's for. So those are for. Help me out, David. What do we use the red rooms for?
We use the ones that were held for trauma, neurosurgery, things like that. So we always had one, maybe two, depending on how busy the service was. Red rooms held. Specifically for stuff that rolled in from the ER and things like that, the emergency cases, so they didn't disrupt the rest of the OR.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what happens too is when you have a trauma facility or you have a busy ER, these patients come in and they bump elective people, right? Maybe you've had that happen to you. That's a problem because, of course, we need to take care of those patients that are at risk of losing life and limb. But it disrupts the rest of the schedule. The surgeon that was originally scheduled has to wait now, and they have lives, right? They can't work until midnight and then come back in at 6 a.m. and be safe. So it's hard to juggle when that happens. And so we have built-in slack to the system to try to prevent that. And it's always a trade-off to see, do I want to give up some efficiency to make sure that the surgeons aren't moved? And then you have things like if they get bumped too far back, and then you start having your evening crew come in who isn't necessarily used to doing the types of cases that they're doing, and so it can even create quality and safety issues. Okay, so talking a little bit about surgery room turnover, we're going to get into efficiencies in a little bit, and some of the benchmarks. But one of the things that we talk about when we talk about room turnover is when you go into the operating room, and I think you guys may have talked about wheels in, wheels out. Is that right? Yeah. So that's what we're talking about here. So when somebody goes into the surgery, wheels out to wheels in, I think probably David is what you were doing. But when you bring somebody into surgery, they're going to the OR and they're finished with the OR. Now that's the part of the process that we don't try to shrink, right? What it takes to do surgery, we don't touch that. We do in some ways by parallel processing, but we'll get into that later. But when we finish the surgery, there's a period of time where we have to do a number of tasks, and then we can start the next surgery, right? And as it sounds like you know, that's the wheels out to wheels in. And so that's also called the room turnover. And we organize carefully. It's a choreographed dance the way we turn that over, and we measure the time. And so an average time to remove all the dirty instrumentation, clean the room, prepare the next case, bring the instrumentation back into the room, and get all the interviewing of the patient done, get them back in. In an ambulatory surgery center where you go home, the benchmark for that is 25 to 30 minutes. So it's a pretty fast turnaround. And then in an inpatient hospital, maybe it's 45 or less. So there's not a lot of slack in the process, and we monitor that very closely because we have to, and it's a good way to not let efficiencies escape us. Okay, so we talked about the room turnover metric, and we're going to talk about a few others: on-time starts, physician turnover and room turnaround, room utilization, and block utilization. Okay, so I've referred a little bit to this when we talked about the other blocks, but I'm going to go into this. So on-time starts, it's just what it sounds like, right? And it sounds simple, and that it's not important, right? But when it's your surgery, it's important. And so what happens is there's a phenomenon of when you start late, you end late. It just tends to spin out of control. And, not to mention if everybody is lackadaisical about the timing around the surgery, that just becomes a cultural phenomenon, right? So the idea is that starting on time is an important factor for efficiency. You'll have a lot of people in the operating room tell you that they don't think it's worth much. It is worth something because it's a leading indicator that everything else was prepared. So the patient was prepared correctly. The instrumentation is where it needs to be. The patient is in the room at the right time. The staff is there ready to go, right? It's the culmination of all the work that we're about to talk about. And so what you're really looking at with this is the goal is always 100%, but that's not going to be the case. But somewhere around 85 to 90% is really good. And some organizations that I've been involved with have been that high. Many of them struggle at 70 to 80. It's also an indication of physician engagement a lot of times because ultimately if your start time is low, what could be happening is that the surgeons they're not engaged in coming in at the exact times that they're supposed to start. They roll in, maybe they have other priorities. And that sounds, like, oh, well, just talk to the surgeon, they're just being recalcitrant. Well, there's other factors as well. So if I'm a surgeon, and by the way, when I was a junior nurse, I have to admit that a lot of times I felt like the surgeons were always the root of my problems. I secretly kept that to myself. And then when I got more senior, I started working with physicians. I realized how complicated some of those factors are. And I have a lot of sympathy for surgeons and what they handle and what they go through now. And one of the things that can happen is from a surgeon standpoint, if I don't trust that my team's going to be ready at 7 a.m., right? And every time I get there, we don't start until 7:20. At some point, I'm going to start thinking that I shouldn't arrive till 7:20, right? And so there's also a cultural uh, factor that's not just about the surgeon not showing up on time. Room turnovers, we talked about that. So the goal in ambulatory surgery is as low as 20 minutes. That depends a lot about your case mix and things like that as well. It even boils down to how long does it take for the cleaner that you use to dry, right? And that may be 5 minutes, but in 5 minutes of somebody not being able to be in there working, then it's down to that consideration.
I see a hand up with Oliver.
Oh, of course.
Hey, yeah, I've got a quick question on the on-time starts. For that measure, at what point of the process do you guys measure the on-time start? Is it, when the anesthesia begins, when the briefing is, or when the surgery actually begins?
That's a great question. There's different ways to do it. Typically, it's OR start, so wheels in, right? And so that's the on-time start. So if you want to start at 7:30, what I've seen typically is that you're in the door. Now the problem with that is that doesn't necessarily mean that you start the surgery efficiently, right? So people learn to game the system, and so they get the patient in there, and then it takes a long time to start the procedure, right? So we measure all of those aspects. So we measure in the room time, we measure in room to surgical cut time, we measure anesthesia start to, or in room to anesthesia start. We even measure anesthesia start to cut, right? And so all of those sectors are important because you have to understand where time might be escaping, right? And you also want to be able to control the system so that people don't just change their behavior and not improve it. Great question. Okay, so cleaning. So as you can see, you have a great diagram here on the left of how we manage an infection prevention situation, right? And so this is called the zone cleaning method. So what happens is there will be stages that again, it's a choreographed process, right? And so this is a very important process because it's complicated. It requires people to be highly reliable, and it also can result in an infection if it's not done correctly, right? In healthcare, though, I think in a lot of ways we learn to live in this world of high risk, and the people that do this work, they're housekeepers and they're central supply technicians. They're some of our, there's a high percentage of immigration, like backgrounds. They're probably the lower end on the education scale. There's a lower end on what we've trained them to do. And so what we've realized over time is that these are important roles that we need to dedicate more resources toward. And you'll hear me talk a little bit about this when we get to the sterile processing area. But our housekeepers are hugely important to us. And so we engage them, and they're a part of our team because we need them, they need us. And they're in there every day working hard. They're cleaning up. They have a difficult job, and so the successful managers are good at engaging the entire team and making sure that they understand what the risk is, that they're dedicated to buying into what they have to do, which is sometimes not easy. And your good teams really have a tight environmental services team embedded within them. And so what we do is we clean specific areas at specific times, with the floor being, for instance, would be last, right? Why would the floor be last? Well, because you're walking all over the floor the entire time. And so you clean from essentially top to bottom, right? And so every time it's cleaned the same way so that there's standardized processes. And each of these creates a time window where you have to, as I said, we call it dwell time. Whatever you've used to clean the rooms needs some time to kill the bacteria. So I bet you never thought that cleaning an operating room would be so complicated, but that's the way we do it. And there's actually, let's talk about this technology. There's been some recent technology that has helped make, so now even with that process, right? I'm sure you can probably understand. An operating room is never going to be sterile with human beings cleaning it, right? And in an operating room, I ask my students this question, and most of the time they answer it like this. I say, what is sterile in the OR? And they say everything. And I say, no, not the hallway, right? And they, no, not the hallway, just the operating room. And I say, well, the operating room is not sterile. There's actually only a 24 by 24-inch square immediately over the surgical site that's sterile. Everything else is non-sterile. We do the best we can, right? But we're always going to miss some of these things, and you can't, completely sterilize a room. But as of recently, on the right-hand side, you can see there it's a surgical robotic ultraviolet unit. And so you can bring this into the operating room in between cases, usually at night, once a day. We do what's called a terminal cleaning with it. So we leave it in there for 20, 30 minutes, and the UV rays kill 90% of the remaining bacteria. So although it's not perfect and it's never going to be sterile, it's pretty great for us to be able to do that on top of it, just to make sure that our whatever areas are not going to get missed.
Hey, Jason, I've seen those for a long time, just around. I've never actually seen one in use in the hospital. Are they becoming more and more common? I mean, I've known about them, I should say, but I've never really seen them used.
They are. They're used in most ORs, and most hospitals have them now, but they're selectively used. When I talk about this to my students, I usually will start by asking them, when's the last time they've seen a hospital close down and send all their patients home, right? They don't. And so how do they clean? Well, they clean one room at a time, and that means that it's never going to be perfect. But they do have these adjuncts that we use. For a long time, it was people were skeptical about the efficacy, and I think over time they've come to understand the research and that there is benefit. It's not an all-in-one solution. It's not a silver bullet, but it's an adjunctive technology.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
There's one other hand up.
Oh, sure.
Albert, your hand up.
How you doing, sir? Thank you for the bit of information as far as the OR cleaning process.
My pleasure.
With regards to the cleaning list, do you all have like a checklist that is digital that actually captures everything that's done, the start time, group, and whatnot, so you have an idea as far as how quick or how delayed the clean process is? Because I mean, you stated that there's a certain amount of time that the Sullivan has to air out. I'm pretty sure for safety reasons,
right?
And this, that, and other. And of course, with the instruments that are autoclaved that are put there, which is a part of the sterile environment that you're talking about. I mean, there's pieces and parts that are working all together. So with that said, I'm sorry. What checklist do you have? Is it within a separate system that the EVS department uses, or is it something that is paper?
Yeah. So every hospital has a system. They have to. Not from a regulatory standpoint, from a functionality standpoint, right? That type of workflow is too complicated not to have a checklist, but it's varied, and it's not always going to be standardized for every facility. But you guys know Deming, right? You guys study Deming in this class?
Oh, we study all of Deming's work, so
there you go.
It's essentially a lot of lean, right?
Yeah.
I know it goes way beyond that, but
Deming's the guy that figured this out before anybody else. So he says what doesn't get measured doesn't get improved, right? And so that's from a standpoint of a healthcare administrator or a leader. Hopefully, you're always moving towards that. And what David said is exactly right. We're nutty about trying to reduce variation in healthcare, right? So it goes from the spectrum of having something integrated into the health record that can notify the operating room, depending on what areas are checked by the healthcare or by the um, housekeeping personnel. And that's very effective, right? It can go up on a board and say, ding, ding, OR7's ready. To at UC Davis, which is the Trauma 1 facility I showed you earlier, we had people just yell out the door, you know, OR7's ready. And so that's what we would do. And you do the best with what you have, but, it goes from very low tech to very high tech, depending. But the more you can organize it with whatever, soldiers you have, you go to war and you go with what you have. Okay, so physician turnover time. So we talked about turnover, and we monitor that by we look at the apple from every side, right? So we think, okay, what are the ORs doing? What is there a certain OR that starts late all the time, right, or that has a longer turnover, or is there a certain physician that has tendencies? So we're always thinking about tendencies. Even down to the staff members, for instance, when it comes to late starts. Sometimes when we get down into the weeds as to, well, is there a commonality in these late starts? And you would find out that maybe an RN circulator has some sort of a problem with this, right? And it's a conversation you can mitigate that with. Well, the same thing happens with physician turnaround times, right? The room in, or out, wheels out to wheels in. We break that down by operating room. We break it down by physician. We break it down by physician service. So I'll have a good idea of what service is averaging what time, and they'll all be different. Does anyone have a sense as to why that would be the case? I'll give you a hint. It's not personal variation. Okay, well, let me tell you this. How much instrumentation do you think it would take to have brain surgery or spine surgery? A lot, right? Yeah. So, and then, there are some that are very minimal, right? So some general surgeons and trauma surgeons, a lot of them came from the battlefield and they feel like they can do surgery with a fork and a spoon, right? But in order to do spine surgery, you have a lot of equipment, and all of that equipment needs to be turned over. And we'll get into that a little bit later because the instrumentation, a lot of people don't know how intricate this instrumentation is and how we have to clean it and how all of that works. But a lot of times it has to do with the surgical service, and that's why it takes longer for some to turn over than others. But within that, we also try to understand the physicians in there too, and that's where it does get personal, right? We start to say, okay, what's the variation here? You're using a different system than your colleague, or you have a different approach even, and that's traditionally a very difficult thing for a hospital administrator to have a conversation with a surgeon, right? Is, hey, could you do your surgeon differently? It doesn't go very well, but at times that is actually the conversation that happens is, are you aware that all of your colleagues are using a different workflow in part of their surgery, and would you be willing to adopt that, right? So we get to that level when we get to the awareness of where the issues are. Okay, so room utilization. Earlier we talked about the block schedule, right? And we talked about who gets the room assigned, and we had add-ons that bump people, and then we have the first come, first serve that fill in the blanks in behind, right? And room utilization is the measurement of how somebody is doing with their block time that we've given them. What kind of, how good of a steward are they with the OR time that we've given? OR time is very expensive ultimately, and when it's not managed well, you can't just always bring a patient and a surgeon and a staff member and get them all there within 5 minutes if they're not organized, right? So we have dead time, and when we have that dead time, it's killer because that's something that we're all at work. we could have a patient under anesthesia doing the procedure. Instead, we're looking at an empty OR because we're not organized enough. So we're constantly trying to improve that, especially since at the end of the day, that there's only so much time in an OR that you can have. So, for instance, even in your neighborhood hospital that has an emergency room and 24-hour services, there's not surgery going on 24 hours a day. So very often what happens is that drops off significantly. There's a prime time. And so it drops off significantly after 3 or after 5 o'clock. And there's a reasonable explanation for why that is. As I said before, surgeons ultimately, we can plug staff in to a greater degree around the clock, but if you have a limited number of surgeons and they have a limited number of hours in a day that they can work. And studies have shown that somebody that works over 12 hours is several times more likely to make a mistake, right? And so we can't expect people to operate at a high level for that much time. So until the day where we get a second shift of surgeons that are willing to work, we're going to be working 12 to 14 hours a day for the most part. Those add-ons will still filter through 24 hours a day, but that's with essentially a skeleton crew. So that room utilization is usually measured during prime time, okay? But one of the things that was always my mission as a director is, I'm a big believer if you have the space for it, and sometimes you don't have a big enough OR, and that's a different problem to solve, but if you have a space for it, volume is a great deodorant. So you do the best you can to have as much volume, get the patients access as open as you can, and that has to do with salesmanship of operating room space. It has to do with changing those systems. It has to do with talking people into working later, opening Saturday blocks, right? All of those things are things that you would want to do to try to open this operating room up so that people can get greater access. But a lot of times as the director, you'll get surgeons that come to you and they're frustrated, and they tell you that, okay, fine, I'll work on, we need to improve this. I'll work later, and that's not practical. And so I'll ask, do you want to start on a Saturday? We'll open a block. Well, that's not always popular either, right? So we do what we can, but ultimately we're trying to hit this from different angles constantly. Okay, as we talked about it, this is block utilization. So you're looking at the chart here, and the red line is the goal. It's 80%, 85%. So for various reasons, there's no such thing as 100% goal in the operating room. Okay, 80 to 90% is really the maximum that you can achieve in this because of the natural variation and just human element in running a block. But 80% is a pretty good block schedule. It's very good. So what you're trying to get to is to average that overall. As you can see, since this is a real example of a utilization, we have each surgeon, these are by surgeons by several months. And so this is the way that you organize the block schedule. You report this out, and then every quarter you look at these numbers. And for instance, you might write a policy that says, for every month that you're below 70%, if you have 3 months in a row or 3 out of 4 months, for instance, then you'll get a warning. And then in the next quarter, if you have more than that, or that many again, then we'll take away your block, right? And so it's something that a director coming in, it's a costly thing to do from a political standpoint, but it's very worth it is if you can correct that problem and get everybody to just buy into the fact that all it is being thoughtful about the resource, talking with your schedulers if you're a surgeon, telling us when you're going on vacation, right? I mean, it can be that simple. And so those are the things that you try to create is just more awareness, top of mind, right? if people aren't thinking about it, then they're not going to be able to improve it. Okay, so we've talked about all these general principles around the operating room and what what we look at to try to manage it. Some other things that we talk about with productivity. So we look at the number of staff, and we have detailed staffing plans about how many people it takes to run a room, how many hours they're going to work, how many hours of surgery there is. And I just sent a video earlier today of a presentation that I made that was talking about that very fact, just the matching the staffing versus the surgery, the surgeon personal schedules to the block schedules, and how to navigate all of that. So we manage that, and then we put the staff included and then excluded from the calculation. We start to look at things like how compact is the surgery schedule. There's something that people will talk about, smoothing, where, so for instance, you might have on a Monday through Friday, you have all different services, right? And each service has a characteristic of its service. And so, for instance, you have a cardiac service. They're always going to be, they'll go a long day, right? So they might do one case from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. Well, they're going to get 100% utilization for their time, right? Because they were in the entire time. Well, if you get another service like general surgery who might have 6 or 7 surgeries during that time, and they have a turnover for each period in between that, then they have an innate, more challenging situation to achieve their time, right? So you have to be aware of that. You have to take account for it, but also hold accountability for the fact that, it is what it is, right? Everybody's not exactly the same, but there's something called smoothing, where what you try to do is you be mindful about the way that you're allocating your block schedule, even within all of that work that we talked about organizing it and removing time and all that. In some cases, you might even consider which day you're going to add time or take time away, because over time, if you're mindful, you can start to mix and match services that complement each other, right? And then the idea is that if you can get that surgical staffing demand to be relatively even throughout the week, then you're going to have less variation in your staffing, you're going to have less overtime, and you're ultimately going to have a lower cost of labor, right? Because overtime costs 1.5 times what a regular hour costs. So that all goes into it, right? And then not only that, but what's the case mix? So if you have an orthopedic service that is just does a shoulder scope arthroscopy that can be done in 45 minutes, and you have a doctor that has an exclusive service where it's more like sports medicine, it's smaller procedures, and they do tons of those, versus a doctor that's going to do a bunch of total hip replacements. Even within the service, there's different case mixes that make this a different situation. And so you're constantly looking at that. As a director, you're constantly hearing, and I hesitate to call it an excuse, because it's a legitimate differentiation, but when trying to manage human behavior, you're trying to adjust for that, right? And say, I understand that's different, but we all have a mission, and so how do we get what this looks like for you? How do we get that within the framework that we're trying to work through? We also talk about on-time arrival of patients and physicians. So sometimes it's not the physician that arrives late, it's the patient. So what are you going to do about that, right? Well, it does hit the operating room team. So just like on an airline, if your passenger gets there 5 minutes late and the crew waits for them, their wheels up is going to be late, right? And so they're penalized for that. The operating room is too, except for the fact that we don't make excuses for the fact that it was the patient. And oftentimes you find that when something is coded as the patient, really what it means is that the patient told me immediately prior to surgery that they had to use the bathroom. Okay, well, there's a follow-up conversation to that says, okay, well, why did we wait till 2 minutes before surgery to ask the patient if they had to use the restroom, right? That's always something we ask the patient. So sometimes there's an iteration of questions that comes along, but at the end of the day, maybe you can't do anything about a patient that wakes up with a cold and they cancel, right? But we do keep track of that, and we track it because it's another source of delays on the day of surgery. So other things that can affect the productivity is the physical layout of the facility. So as I said before, if you have plenty of room, there's a lot of things you can do to improve volume. But some ORs don't have enough room, and some ORs are so packed that they don't have the ability to add volume. In fact, they're being constricted by things like not enough ORs or not enough post-op beds in the rest of the hospital. So patients will come out of the operating room and have to stay in the recovery area longer than what they would normally do. And so what ends up happening then is that you're sitting in that area and nobody can really go into the operating room because we can't take people into the OR if we don't know where they're going to be able to recover immediately after anesthesia, right? That's a critical time. So we end up often holding ORs. And then anesthesiologists recover patients in the operating room, and anesthesiologists want to be passing gas. They don't want to be, guarding someone's airway. So it's not a popular situation to be in. And here's another example. I had an interview a long time ago with Cedars-Sinai Hospital in LA, and I went through their facilities. I met their teams, and they had, I don't remember how many, but I believe they had 4 satellite operating rooms in the hospital. So that's a challenge, right? And when I saw that, I knew that right away, because what happens is you have 4 different operating rooms, which essentially is 4 different cultures. There are attractive areas. There are rooms that are bigger than others, right? And which makes it easier to do your work and move the equipment. So there's always this situation where I want to work there, I don't want to work there. And then you have equipment that you have to transport in between these different areas. So logistically, it's exponentially more complicated when you have those satellites and distance in between the operating rooms. So all of that matters when you're talking about that. And that all plays into the idea of workflow patterns, because these workflows are very complicated. There's lots of barriers in why you have to walk a case cart, which is full of dirty instruments, 100 yards, right? That's not ideal. And so those are the types of things that we try to work through. Oops. Okay, so what you're looking at here, what this is it's a graphical that tells you a little bit about the things. It's a lot to look at, but what it does is on the bottom, it talks about sequential processes, right? Processes that have to be done one after the other. And when we get into some of the steps to surgery, you'll see a little bit more, what I think is a little easier to look at and conceptualize. But essentially, there's instrument storage in the red, and that has to be done one after the other, and we'll go through how that's done. Then you have the pre-admission screening process, so the pre-op process. There's this, then that kinds of things that need to happen. The same with the scheduling, as we talked about. You schedule, and then the instrumentation is prepared, the room is prepared, the surgical team gets there. That all has to happen afterwards. And then the governance, of course, things like leadership and administrative control, policies and procedures. Of course, that's always present. And so some of these things, though, as you can see, they're stacked on top of each other, right? And so that's what we call parallel processing. And that's a key factor in efficiencies. So what we do is we talk about the fact that that is a sequential process, or that can be a parallel process. So in other words, don't stop and watch me doing this, because you can actually do your job concurrently, and that can help make us all more efficient. Does that make sense? Okay, let's talk about technology. All right, so as I was talking about earlier, at some point there became this wave of minimally invasive surgery. Okay, so in the first picture that I showed, it showed what it used to be like to have a GI procedure, for instance, or a gallbladder removal. Okay, today that's a 30-minute procedure, and it takes longer to recover from the anesthesia than it does to remove your gallbladder. Before what, and by the way, you have an incision that's this big, right? Before though, as you saw, you would have retractors that are open your belly up this big, right? And so that gives you more chance for skin cells to fall into it, or some sort of bacteria to enter, or accidentally nick an area while they're doing the surgery. Plus, when you're done with the surgery, it gives you a nice big scar, right? And so when we got into this idea of minimally invasive surgery, and I talked to you about the laparoscopics, which is like doing surgery with chopsticks. The beauty of that is that essentially you're sort of inside the belly and doing that surgery underneath the skin with only a few puncture sites. So it looks more like you've been stabbed and then you actually had surgery, right? You have a few puncture sites throughout your abdomen, and they can do almost anything that way. So that was a huge advancement when we started seeing that, and that took a while for the surgeons to be trained in that area. And so there are still surgeons that just don't do laparoscopics, and there are some surgeons that don't know how to do anything else. So but the laparoscopic always took longer. Okay, and there are some people that over time got very fast at laparoscopics, but it always is still very complicated. So whatever you can do with laparoscopics in an hour, you probably can do open in about 45 minutes or less. So there was always that issue, but it was always a dead bang winner because the benefit for the patient was so much greater. So as we moved along, what started happening is we started getting some other technologies. And so robotics is a technology that's been around a long time. There's a company called Intuitive Surgical that started the Da Vinci robot, and that has been around probably 20 years, and they've had almost a complete monopoly for about 15 of those. This is a billion-dollar company. It's a really big dog, and their product is really great. So what they have is, and you can see this picture on the left-hand side. You see a surgeon that's at the what do they call that again? The module, right? And so the surgical module. So what happens is the surgeon's not at the bedside anymore with these procedures. So what happens is the robot, which is on the right-hand side near the monitor, that robot is positioned over the patient, and then there are things that are inserted. They're called trocars, and so those things are inserted manually, right? But they're like laparoscopics. They're just a puncture, and then once those are inserted, the robot it's called docking. You dock the robot. The robot finds these ports and inserts the equipment into those ports automatically. And then once it's docked, it's calibrated so that whatever the surgeon does, it will mimic. And the cool things that's about a surgical robot, potentially it could be done from another country. Now that's not currently legal because we like having our surgeon in the room in case there's a problem, right? But it does free up. There's conversations about places where they don't have access to surgeons, right? Maybe there's something that could be done in the future. The cool thing about robotics is for all those people that never really liked laparoscopics because it's a complete change of the way they were trained, robotics is almost like you take a surgeon and you shrink him down to this big and you put him inside the belly and he does an open procedure inside the belly. So it's very similar to the way that they were trained, that you would do that work. And the cool thing I think about the robot that people don't know is that there's a magnified amount of there's a big training curve. The 50 to 100 cases is what it takes a surgeon to get proficient. But there's a magnified amount of motion that's required. So there's a larger room for error because in order to, let me see if I can get it in the camera. So in order to move my hand from here to here when I'm doing it is very small. But on the robot, I might have to move to here. And so that allows for less, microscopic error, right? And so it's a really amazing technology in order to protect people, and they can do really amazing things. The question is, at $4 million a piece, how many surgeries do you have to do to recoup that cost, and is it actually ultimately cost feasible? Now, I still see a hand raised. Is there somebody that still has a question?
Yeah, I had a question.
Sure.
I understand the quantitative data that you just stated as far as the $4 million toward recouping return on investment, and you question how many of these surgeries you have to have. But my question is, from a qualitative standpoint, even though it does improve the level of safety and precision, doctors that are now relegated to a robot, almost a video game, so to speak, do you think that care is kind of diminishing just a little bit from the standpoint of the connection with the doctor and the actual warm body? I mean, that is kind of a little bit outside the box, but do you see that happening? I mean, for the sake of safety and improvement, innovation, I get it. I'm all for it. I just had surgery on my hernia, so it's one of those situations where I understand and I appreciate it, but there's another caveat to that. Does that make any sense to you?
It does, and I hear that argument. I hear it from the surgeons, I hear it from the nurses, and it's astute of you to think about that. And it's a challenge because there's a lot of things that in healthcare with technology that take us away from our patients, right? I'm sure if you've been to the doctor, you've noticed that the nurses are on a computer all the time now. And the nurse has to be, and the doctor have to be intentional about ensuring that conversation is still happening authentically. And so there's training around that, right? And there's training around the situation with robotics. But let's remember, the robot is the patient never sees the robot. They're asleep the entire time, right? But I think your point is still valid, is you have to ask your question, the ethical question, what's better, efficiency, saving money, running a better operating room, or better quality and safety? And so I can tell you this, I'm a numbers guy. I've been fixated on the data in an operating room for a long time. I'm an RN, but I'll admit it. That's my gig, right? But in 25 years in the operating room and in healthcare, I've never found a situation where someone was truly more interested in the money than taking care of patients. It's always with the expectation that the quality and safety is without question. It's what can we do after that, right? Now, here's the argument. What is considered quality and safety? Is patient satisfaction quality and safety, right? Is patient satisfaction worth money? Right? And so sometimes those are the questions that you have to ask yourself. I do think that patient satisfaction is something that is very, it has weight in the professional community. And doctors will tell you straight up, they're the ones that have to nurses, for instance, we see a patient when they come in for surgery and we tell them, take this when you get home, good luck, follow up with your doctor. We never see them again. The doctor sees them for years afterwards, right? And so they have a very different patient experience. And so, I think that's definitely what I would call a balancing measure. You have to keep that there all the time to see if it changes, because it's an indication that you're going the wrong direction. That's a long answer, but it's a good question. I think we might have another hand up. Is that true?
I think that was the same one, it looks like.
Okay.
Maybe Jason, this might be a good time to take 10 minutes, you think?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, thank you. So everyone be back 7:28. Give me 10 minutes from there. 7:38. We'll arrive back and give me a chance to go out and get a drink of water. So.
You got it.
Thank you. Yep.
All right. So we were talking about robots before the break. And so we're going to discuss, and it's a great question, great segue earlier about the patient satisfaction and what the patient thinks, because it's going to play into a lot of the decisions we make. So a lot of people will come to you and they'll ask you, are robots worth the cost, right? They're $2 to $4 million depending on which model you buy. And hospitals make a lot of money on surgery, but they don't make $2 million to $4 million that quickly back. So the return on investment is always going to be important. So Paul, the guy who did the previous lecture, this is his slide, and it says, are robots worth the cost? And his answer was yes. And I crossed it out and I said, it depends. So so there's differences of opinion. The answer is yes, but for different reasons. If you buy a robotic setup because you think that you're going to save money on the laparoscopic cholecystectomies that you do, your gallbladder surgery, you're going to spend more money than you make on a robotic case. Okay, the robotic instrumentation is expensive and it's easier to do it with laparoscopics. So if that's your impression, then you're going to lose money on your robotics program. If you have a surgeon that's a robotic surgeon that tells you that you're recruiting them and you buy a robot and they decide they want to go somewhere else, you're going to lose money, right? In fact, you're going to lose your job too if that happens. But so those are all. It's like any technology. There's always a risk in coming that far out of the pocket, right? But at the same time, there are some cases where it improves the outcome of care. So there have been certain areas, prostate surgeries, pancreas surgeries, really difficult surgeries, hugely improving the outcome of patients. So there are some quality-related reasons that a robot is better. Okay, that's a starting point. It may not be less expensive. But if you think about it in a different way, there's other factors that you should think about. First of all, is it reduces the post-operative stay. So somebody can go, it's a minimally invasive surgery. So as opposed to doing an open procedure, you can probably cut their length of stay by 2 or 3 days in the hospital. And if you can do that, that's worth a lot of money, right? Because hospital beds are worth money when they're occupied unnecessarily. So also you're getting surgeons that are coming out of medical school that have this training in robotics exclusively. So that's a recruiting reason to have a robot, right? Also, you'll have, a lot of hospitals consider it a cost of doing business and they have their second robot. Well, what I'm trying to say about that is that they've made the decision strategically that they want a robotics program. And there's probably another reason. Patients out in the community are asking their physicians whether they do robotic surgery or not, right? So there is a bit of a drive from a patient point of view saying, I want this type of care. But you'd be amazed a lot of times. I mean, every patient assumes that their doctor's going to have good bedside care. They just assume it and they expect it. And that is a huge problem when it's not there. But they're also, just like anybody else, consumers of technology. And so they will come to you and say, do you have this latest thing? How come you can't 3D print my knee replacement? I heard that they do that across the street, right? And those are the questions that patients are asking now. So that in and of itself can be a reason for the business strategy. Also, competition and innovation will reduce the cost over time. So there are more than one robotic program now. And for a long time, because Intuitive had such a market control, there are class action suits against them because of the way that they were able to, they had a stranglehold on what they charge people and things like that. So um, it's getting better because there's more competition in the market. Robotics is not an efficient service, so it can be very challenging. The docking and all those procedures are very intricate. They take a while. So it's not a fast procedure to manage. Not to mention that robots are big creatures and you can move them, but it takes a long time. So unless you're willing to dedicate a room 24/7, then there's going to be quirky restrictions around that room, right? So you take the good with the bad. So that's robotics and where that's going. There's another area that's growing in the hospital and even outpatient is cardiovascular services. So if you've ever known anybody that had a stroke, they go to cardiac catheterization as quickly as possible, right? We call that what do we call it? Door to cath is the measure. So just like the OR, the emergency room has their own operating efficiency metrics, right? And so one of those is, and that's a quality metric, door to cath. So by the time you hit the emergency room door with whatever symptoms require that catheterization, you have a time in order it takes for you to get that procedure. And so these are, you might hear them called cardiac cath or interventional radiology. There are these pseudo operating rooms, but what they do is more ambulatory and procedural in nature. But they're highly acute. So they take care of patients, heart patients. They remove clots. They do all sorts of things, and they might do it all through the artery in your upper thigh, right? They can replace a heart valve that way. So it's pretty amazing the things that they're able to do. And what they're starting to do is talk more about integrating these types of procedures into operating rooms when they build new ones. Because the equipment that's required, it's heavy, it's expensive, and it takes a lot of time when you don't have that proximally to where you're doing the work and somebody is in a critical situation. Okay, so we learned about perioperative services. Now we're going to talk about peri-anesthesia. And so peri means around, operative means operative, right? Peri, around anesthesia, right? And so that will be what's characteristically called pre-op, intra-op, post-op. And it's not just the anesthesiologist, it's everything around anesthesia and how we manage those patients. So in pre-op and post-op care, we have a Venn diagram here because they overlap, they work together, right? When they're doing your pre-op interview, it's because we want to be prepared for your anesthesia. When we're doing your post-op recovery, it's all based around the fact that we gave you anesthesia and making sure that you're guarded during that vulnerable period. A little bit of clinical knowledge here, okay? So when you lose consciousness, right, normally when you're sleeping, your body maintains its protective mechanisms, okay? What that means is your body continues to breathe. Your body, although you don't realize it, shifts constantly, right? Because if you were to lay flat on a certain area of your body for hours at a time, it would hurt that area. It would damage nerves. It might even reduce the amount of circulation. So your body has a system to help you do that. And that's called your protective mechanism, for lack of a better term. When you go under anesthesia, we take that away, okay? Which is why general anesthesia, the one where you go to sleep. And that's the reason we have to stick a tube down your throat. That's the reason that we have to have an anesthesiologist monitor your airway, and then also a post-anesthesia care nurse monitor you while you're waking up, right? And so that means you also don't move during surgery. And so positioning in the operating room is very important. Breathing in the operating room is very important. And pain management, obviously, is the reason we take away a lot of those reflexes, is because pain is one of them, right? So understanding that helps this whole thing put into context. So being efficient in these areas, making sure the continuity of care is established so that there's no gaps in falling through the cracks, and then the cost effectiveness. When we talk about efficiency and cost effectiveness and quality, there's always that argument, right? The quality and the money. And so, and some people are very turned off by that in healthcare about talking about the money. Um, and so I rarely talk about efficiency and I rarely talk about cost effectiveness. I talk about value. And the reason value is a better explanation of that is that it never loses quality. It's never at the expense of it, right? So um, it's great that we have something that is low cost, but does it provide the same level of quality? And if the answer is yes to both, then we have value, right? So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about is how can we provide value in our services. Now, you have about half your master's degree now in OR management. Let's talk about what you know. Okay, imagine the perfect surgery preparation. Okay, maybe you know about this already. Maybe you have experience. So there are over 60 steps from start to finish for a person to go through surgery. Okay, and so that starts in the surgical clinic. The clinic, and imagine a situation that's perfect, right? You go to the surgery clinic, the patient is happy and grateful. The case scheduling is done without incident, right? The surgery plan is clear and the procedure is easy to select when the staff is preparing the scheduling. You're able to book in the OR. Schedulers are helpful, and case requests for time are clear and precise with a current and accurate, what we call preference card, which drives the supplies that you'll use. Your surgical consent and your history and physical, your background clinically, are complete and they're thorough so that your doctor has done a safe review of whether this is appropriate and you've agreed. The OR, so then you get to the verification process on the day of surgery, and the OR preps the case. The consent is part of the verification process, and that's why they ask you 150 times what your name is and things like that, right? So the OR staff is ready with their instrumentation, the vendors and supplies, and any kind of tweaks that have to have in the preference card or other processes for final accuracy are all saved and changed so that in the next procedure for the surgeon, that's accurate as well. So there's ongoing iterations. Your pre-op nurse is kind and competent while starting the verification process for your surgery. What's behind the scenes, and we'll talk about this, is case picking. So when they're picking all the instrumentation, they're at the grocery store and they're the chef, right? They're about to cook their meal. They're picking all the trays, the instrumentations, and the carts. They're accurate. They're available. They actually are available for what we need, right? They're not being used somewhere else, and they're ready. The staff, by the time you're about ready to go in, is proficient and diligent and not distracted. The surgeon is comfortable and well rested and in good spirits. The OR is set up when the staff is ready to go, and it's starting on time. Oops. And then you get to the surgery, right? You're ready to start surgery and you're about to go to sleep. The timeout for the surgical team is done while you're awake. It involves your conversation so that you go to sleep comfortable and confident, and you're reassured and calm. So like I said, that's 60 steps to get into the OR doors. And so as you have talked about some of these things that I said that Deming helped us understand, every time you have a step and you have an opportunity for error, if you have 60 steps, then you have an exponentially larger chance for error to happen within that, right? And so it's a very complicated situation to be able to improve that. And frankly, there's always errors in a process like this. The question is it of large consequence, right? You encounter it yourself, right? You look on the paperwork and you say, oh, you're missing this or that piece of paperwork, and a lot of times we can figure that out. But it's not an error-free process. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this. So when we talked about the patient enters the surgery waiting area, we check their two verifiers, which we call their name and their date of birth. That's how we verify that who you say you are is who we actually are. And that's not to make sure you're coming in to get a free surgery. That's to make sure that we actually we are all on the same page, right? You're registered in the computer. You sign a general consent. If you're a Medicare patient, you might sign another form. Versus if you're not, you're admitted through registration. You're escorted to the waiting area to be weighed and then maybe dressed and take your vital signs. You're placed in a pre-op bed. Over that time, the next few minutes, you're visited by a pre-op nurse and an anesthesiologist. You have that conversation. These are important clinical conversations at this point, right? Things that you wouldn't want to miss. The anesthesiologist asks you if anyone in your family's ever died from something called malignant hyperthermia, right? They'll ask you questions about allergies and things like that. We'll ask you about your surgical history and what medications you took. All things that could be of consequence to your health during your anesthesia. We've already started this process long before, right, with your pre-op process. So we prep the patient. We take the patient to the operating room after anesthesia and the surgeon have done their final conversation. Patient goes to the bathroom or the toilet. See that? Who put that there? I should move that backwards in that process. And then the final meds are given. Right, and then a lot of times you start to, your anesthesiologist says count back from 8, and by the time you hit 6, you're already asleep, and you're ready to go. Okay, so we went through what happens on the day of surgery. We didn't talk a lot about what happens before. So usually 2 weeks before surgery, so anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks or so, before surgery, you see your surgeon. And that's a time when the surgeon examines you, determines you're a candidate for surgery, and then has you fill out something called the surgical consent, right? That's you saying, yes, I give you permission to cut my body, and I understand the risks. I understand I may die from it potentially, and I agree that it's necessary. So we do that. And then somewhere within the 30 days prior to surgery, usually about 2 weeks, we do the preoperative testing. Now, the reason we do it at that time is it gives us plenty of time to get ready, and it also helps us make sure that the laboratory values are current and things like that. And then we take a history, and so there's productivity methods in this area as well, so that we're not wasting staff on this area. So we're constantly looking at those opportunities. Now, during the preoperative area and the postoperative area, they're two totally different things, right? The pre-op is all preparatory. Post-op is all reactive, and it's more critical in nature with the patient's care. So we have different staffing methods that we use for pre- and post-op care. Sometimes the staff will flex from one side to the other. And if you've ever been in a recovery room, you'll see that patients it's like a runway, an airport runway. Patients come out of the OR and we organize where they go, right? Not unlike an air traffic controller. And so you might say that first case that comes out, you go to bed 1 and RN Smith, you're going to take that patient. Second patient, you go into 3, and Jason, you're going to take that patient. Third patient goes into 5, and then eventually you make your way around, and then hopefully the person that's number 1 has made enough progress to be ready to take a second. And depending on how fast the cases are coming out, sometimes it happens very fast, but it's an even process for getting everybody involved in how to safely manage the care. And so when we're trying to decide in a pre and post area how to staff, what we look at is, so you would think, right, when you're staffing for, you're managing a target, you're staffing your hours, right? And you know how long you need somebody. So everybody on your staff works 9 to 5 and things like that. But in a PACU, post anesthesia care unit, what we essentially staff to is the chance of a patient coming out. And that doesn't always happen exactly the way we planned for the reasons that I've told you before, right? So another reason to keep variation to a minimum, because it spreads, right? The pebble in the water affects everything. So the strange thing about staffing a PACU is that you have to justify why you're staffing higher than is historically needed, right? And so if you're staffing on an average, then you're going to be wrong half the time. So what we do, and I always had to argue this for my vice president, is that I staffed at 75 to 80% of the confidence interval, right? And so so that means that 20% of the time I'm wrong, but 80% I'm not, and we have the right amount of staff. And during that 20% of time, we figure it out, right? And that usually works pretty well, but it's hard to argue when your chief nursing officer walks through your unit and everybody's sitting there waiting for patients, right? So that's always one of the things that drove me crazy is like, I know you're working hard, but keep busy. Look like you're doing something useful, right? Go, go organize the supply room, something like that. Okay, PACU standard. So here's the things that affect PACU efficiency as well. So we talked about the staffing and why we need to have more, and I'm going to tell you all the things that you can do in a PACU to stay busy. So when somebody comes out of surgery, just like in the operating room with surgeons, there's different types of anesthesia, right? There's local anesthesia, which is essentially just numbing the area. There's regional anesthesia, where you have an entire leg that's blocked, or a spinal block, right, during pregnancy or during labor, for instance. And then there's general anesthesia, which is where you're put to sleep. General anesthesia is the most, carries the most risk. And so depending on where you are on that continuum, that also plays into how we staff the area. If there's pediatrics or other really high acuity patients, we staff that differently. So there's a lot of things that come into it. There's minimum staffing requirements in PACU, so you have to have always 2 staff members in a PACU at all times, 24 hours a day, anytime the operating room is going. In the PACU, we try to, a good measure of efficiency in the PACU, assuming you have beds to move them to, is about 60 minutes. Sometimes, you'll see 90 if there's a lot of high-end heavy cases, but 60 to 90 is pretty reasonable. If it's longer than that, usually you have to get in there and start asking questions of the nurses about what they're waiting on for transport. Okay. All right, surgical processing. All right, this is, I think, something that most people don't know anything about, and I think it's a really interesting place. So it's anybody ever worked in a restaurant? I'm sure somebody, right? There you go. I never did. My brother did. But if you've ever worked in the done dishes in a restaurant, right? Or seen somebody do it, it's a hard job. So that's what these guys do. It's an oversimplification that they wash dishes, but essentially that's what it is. But it's very intricate. So there's issues in the sterile areas. I talked about the training standards. It's historically a low-wage position, as I said, dishwashers. I don't believe that, by the way. I'm just using that as an example. It's considerably more intricate, and it gets more so, and we'll talk about some of the instructions that people are expected to follow. There's different types of sterilization, and all of them, if they're not followed explicitly, could result in an item not being sterilized correctly, right? So you have a huge opportunity for a catastrophic failure. There is increased scrutiny by surveyors. It's a survey. I survey for ambulatory surgery centers, and it's one of your favorite places to go to, right? Because there's always going to be something to find there, and it's highly important if you do. So we spend a lot of time there. It's still not perceived, as I said, by C-suites as something that's super important or a highly technical area, but it can definitely cause problems from quality, and it can also cause problems with an efficiency standpoint. And we'll go into that a little bit. Okay, so instructions for use.
I think there's sorry, Jason.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know, Jennifer, if that was up from before or not.
Question about the packing, I think.
Sure.
I work in a hospital, and our pre-op and PACU is in like the same. It's like one unit, and they just kind of like rotate depending on the volume. So like in the beginning of the day, most of the days or beds usually end up being pre-op, and then as the day goes on, it shifts, and then people have more demand for the PACU needed bed. And that's pretty common elsewhere, and then it's pre-op and hospice, and they kind of rotate in that way also, just to kind of meet the different demands throughout the day.
Yeah, it's not always the case, but your PACU manager is doing a good job. I can tell you that. So basically, if you go into what you don't want to see in a PACU is you go there and you visit the staff, and the pre-op nurses say, "Oh, I work in pre-op," and the PACU nurses say, "I work in PACU," and you say, "Do you ever go to either one?" And they go, "No, I work here. I don't go over there." Right? They're similar skill sets, and what you want to do is cross-train your staff, and what you're referring to is what we call a blended unit. And so you flex up, you flex down. There's nobody entering surgery at 3 p.m., right? But there's definitely somebody coming out. And so that's critical in order to be able to run a good OR. It's a challenge in the union environment, which is very strong in California, because sometimes historically those are things that haven't been asked of the staff, and they might resist it. But ultimately, as a manager, if I moved in a union environment even, and that was the case, that would probably be one of the first things that I tried to enact, would be to work through that and ask people to flex. It's the right thing to do, and it makes sense.
I work at a non-union.
Say that again?
Like non-union.
Okay. And I've been in union facilities that do it too, but yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Good question. Okay, so we have this thing called instructions for use, and this is something that sterile processing works with. And so what happens is they have the ability to clean these items, but every item is supposed to be processed differently. So these instructions for use, when a company applies for their FDA clearance, they write these instructions based on clinical trials and the safety of their product. And they tell you that for this instrument, you have to run the sterilizer for this amount of time. You have to clean them in this sort of way. And then you have to run them through an agitator, essentially, to get some of what we call bioburden, which is a fancy word for human tissue, off of the instrument so that it's not cooked with that stuff on it. And so if I have, at UC Davis, as I was telling you earlier, our sterile processing, they touched 5 million instruments a year. And so that's the level of volume that they're handling. And so they're not all different instructions for use, but many of them are very different, and it's too many to memorize, let's put it that way. So oftentimes they have a book or a computer system, and then that relies on how diligent the person is in following that, which can sometimes be a little bit of a burden, right? So there's a lot of barriers in the process. So what happens typically is the instrumentation, when they're closing down the room, it's bloody or whatever it is. There's tissue on it. It needs to be cleaned. They take it to what they call decontamination, where it's pre-washed, and then there's an ultrasonic washer, an agitator, that takes some of that material off, and then there's a washer, a separate wash, and then a decontaminator. Depending, robotic equipment requires some different work, right? And so all of that has to be done. The next time, and so what happens is eventually they take that into sterilization. And so once that's done, it's ready for sterilization, or they call it cooking the instruments. They have to organize those carefully. They have to categorize them and inventory them. And then they put those back in a tray in an organized fashion that the next person to use it knows what they're looking at. And they call that stringing the instruments, so they're all put together. So once that's done, they open up the sterilizer, and they have biological indicators in there that'll tell them if it's sterilized or not. Sometimes those are not valid, and so they'll have to run that again. Sometimes these are trays that the surgeon is holding a surgery in order to go. So those are all things that can hold up cases. A lot of times, what that is a sign is that you need to buy more trays as an administrator. But those are things that can happen. And then what happens is, once that sterilization takes place, let me back up. Right after they disinfect and decontaminate the instruments, they have to assemble them, as I said. Assembly is where they take essentially a huge hodgepodge of instruments, and they handpick them and put them in an organized fashion so that whoever is doing that procedure, which is different than another 100 procedures that they're doing, it's strung exactly the way they would expect to find it. Then they put that in the sterilizer. If it sterilizes and the indicator says that it's correct and ready, then they never open it again until it's ready for surgery. So that's the process. Here's an example of what decontamination looks like. It's a deep sink. And if you're an employee there, you wear full protective gear while you're doing it. Sometimes these instruments are sharp, and so it's not uncommon to have an accident and somebody gets stuck with something. We take great caution to prevent that, but that's what you face. A lot of it has human tissue on it, so you get in the picture that it's not an easy job. Okay, so there's definitely a lot that needs to happen. They have timers because certain things have to be done according to a certain time. It's full of flushing devices and temperature monitors, so it's a very intricate situation. So instrument assembly, as I said, when you're putting together 5 million instruments a year, it can get messy pretty quickly. And if you don't have an organized crew and a talented manager, you're going to have a pretty messy system down there. So if you have a good system, then oftentimes that can be a worry that you don't even realize is being solved for you, because when everything isn't ready, when the trays aren't the way they're supposed to be, it undermines everything that happens afterwards. And so when you start a procedure and you open it up and it's not organized the way it's supposed to be, then that puts everybody on off their game, right? And so it cascades. And so this is how errors start. And so the more, and that's why we always have outcome measures to tell us how is everything doing before that. So you try to pick off things that are something that you can do about little by little, and next thing you know, you have an efficient process over years. So by the way, in instrumentation, it's not just instruments, it's devices, it's equipment, right? A lot of times these pieces of equipment have electronics or light sources, and so they're managing all of that as well. Okay, so here's some tips to improve efficiency. So getting an inventory management system for sterilization areas is really important. The problem is that it's not feasible to scan every 5 million instruments. So ultimately what you end up doing is you just scan the tray, and so you know where the tray is. Problem is when you put all of those instruments into a sink, you don't put one tray at a time. You might get 25 trays out of a surgery. So oftentimes what you have is a bunch of them dumped into a sink. And imagine, having to look through there, clean everything perfectly, and then pick it out and know where it goes out of the 3 or 4 trays you just put in there, right? This is a it's innately inefficient, right? And it's something that if you push too far on the efficiency side, you might lose the quality. And so that's why I think it's a big headache for everybody involved. And I think for a long time, leaders just wished it didn't exist and hoped it didn't come up on surveys. And now I think, all realize that there's a huge amount of liability there if you're not all over it. And so I think we all see that, and it's important for the patient, right? Of course. So, all right. So here's some examples of some of the equipment. As you can see, the sterilizer up top on the left there, it can do multiple trays at the same time. So if you have something like that, then it can be very efficient. But one of these trays, they might take 90 minutes start to finish to sterilize it. So these aren't quick processes. And, if you're doing 100, like I had 34 rooms, so if you're doing 4 procedures a day on average per 34 rooms, right, you're talking, what is that, 140 cases a day. You're going to have a lot of those sterilizers around, and there's going to have to be a lot of people moving this equipment around and be highly safe and have high quality. It's something that if you think a lot about, it'll keep you up at night. Okay, we talked earlier about robotic cleaning. So each of these robotic pieces of equipment are all different. This is highly electrical. These are robots, right? They're robotic arms, and they're designed to simulate what a surgeon would do, but from a robotic perspective. So the way that they need to be cleaned is different. They can be damaged easily, and they're very expensive. And so I'll give you an example of something that happened to me. I was in a well-run facility, and we'd been doing robotics for years. And one day I was, for whatever reason, a little bit more involved in something down there than I had been in the past. And I didn't even know this, but between myself and between the manager of sterile processing, it came out that the robotic instrumentation that we were cleaning didn't have the correct sink in order to clean these instruments. Now, is that ultimately going to result in an infection? Well, the truth is we don't know, but what I can definitely tell you is that we were liable for any kind of regulatory problems, and potentially it could keep somebody from cleaning the instrumentation correctly. That's a problem because that deep sink would require some more plumbing and things like that, and so you're talking about not a fast fix. So it was going to take 12 months for us to get that sink installed. And so what we ended up doing was we bought really, a huge plastic bin that was, something you might see at a O'Reilly Auto Parts or something like that. And we used that in order to hold the water. And we did a little rig where we had a tube in the bottom and some well-placed, PVC pipe, and we figured it out. But that's just what we had to do because we're ultimately putting patients at risk, and it's not always as easy as telling somebody to switch it out. Okay, so I told you a little bit about assembly and how intricate it is. So there's a lot that goes down to it. So as I said, when you get the tray from the operating room, okay, here's a metric that we used to see how this is my favorite metric for determining how the relationship is with the OR and sterile processing, because as you might expect, whenever somebody gives a tray to somebody and they never see them again, and the person opens it up and it's not well managed and it's bloody and there's material all over it when they could have been rinsing it upstairs when they were using it, there's going to be fingers pointed, right? And so what my favorite metric is having some sort of tracking on when that is occurring in sterile processing, because that gives me an idea. Because ultimately, if you're getting that bioburden, we call it, then that's going to that's ultimately going to undermine your ability to safely care for patients. So it can't happen, and it's a very intricate process. And so here's an example of the types of instrumentation you might find for one tray, right? I mean, we're talking about a lot of instruments that all have to be cleaned and then all have to be organized in a way that the next team can use it effectively. Okay, so now let's say that you figured this all out. You have a good team, they're doing a good job, and they're managing their trays well and their instrumentation. Here's some things that can go wrong from there. So let's say you have trays that have too many instruments in them. Well, what's that going to do? Well, that's going to create unnecessary burdens, right? And so you're having to count more instruments. You're having to look through and figure out what's going to be used and what's not going to be used. If there's the wrong mix of instrumentation, maybe it's more of a challenge for you to do what you want to do efficiently. If you open the tray for one or two instruments and then you throw everything else away and then somebody processes that in sterile processing in the way that we just saw, that's a lot of waste, right? So there's always these opportunities, even within a good system, to try to prevent from waste occurring. So what we a lot of times do is if we can remove a instrument from a cycle of sterilization, it saves us money. We spend money on the chemicals, we spend money on the materials that we wrap the instruments in. So as a manager, it's always good for you to be able to tie something to a cost. And so because that gets you support for trying to build an infrastructure to prevent that, right? So oftentimes sterile processing is a great place for an OR manager or leader to look for opportunities to improve the OR, believe it or not. So this is the way that we package and store trays. As you can see at the bottom on the right, that's the blue wrap is that indicates that it's sterile. And if you ever go into an operating room and you see blue, then that usually means don't go anywhere near it. But this is what and this paper is not cheap that we cover this in. It's a special type of paper. And that's why if you can save money on an instrument, that it actually can save money, because you're not using those supplies. So this is what I told you about with a case cart, we call this, okay? So essentially all this is a cart that we bring in from sterile processing to the operating room when it's time to start. Because as we said, you want that equipment to be there when it's time to start. So as you can see, we put a bunch of trays in there, and those are all sterilized. And so what happens is you want to make sure, and as I said before, the preference card when the case is scheduled, that's a recipe card for the chef. And so when we pick those items, we put those in a case cart like this. And, unlike maybe at a restaurant where the chef can pivot and say, instead of garlic, I'm going to use something else. Sometimes we can't do that, right? And so if we can't find something, it's really a problem. It's catastrophic potentially. So the more you can be organized in the way that these are picked and managed, the better. So this is an example of that. And in the era of supply chain challenges, a lot of times what can happen is even within these systems, you have a really well dialed machine, but then you could have an out stock of a piece of instrumentation or some supplies, right? And so even within that system, you have to have the ability to pivot and grab other things. And sometimes those changes can even result in a surgeon doing his surgery differently than he would prefer. And so those are the types of things that go on behind the scenes that you have no idea are affecting the outcome of the surgery. And another reason why, frankly, I have a lot of sympathy for surgeons, because there's so many things that can affect their ability to do their job and their outcomes. And as I said, they're with the patient long term. We're not, right? And so if I were a surgeon and I came in and a system that I have nothing to do with was jacked up and it affected my outcome of my surgery that I did everything correctly for, that would be hard to smile and say that's okay, right? And so I see I see that that's a challenge. But the good surgeons understand that they're part of a team, and when they can manage that situation well, the team will break their back for them. So I see a lot of good behavior around that. Okay, so summary on what you saw with the cart is that the idea is that the carts are picked. They're not picked early because, as I said, there might be only so many trays to go around. So the idea is you're picking those as soon as they're needed, but not before. And I know that sounds crazy, right? Because it's like, why wouldn't you be more prepared? We just don't have the storage. If I had 104 cases a day at 25 trays per procedure, I would need 3 hospitals the size of the one I currently work in order to store it, right? So we just have to be more efficient than that when we're making our decisions on how to manage this. So here's what it all boils down to. You've gotten it start to finish. And here's some of the work that we ultimately do, and this is how it's put into place. This is called a driver diagram, okay? And so this is how it's all organized on a big picture. So on the left-hand side, you can see the goal. We want our best teams, we want our best processes, the best support, and the best patient outcomes, right? That's what we're trying to get to. If you break that down to the right, the primary drivers of that are cultural, increase role clarity and accountability and develop the OR staff, increase access for available patients, increase stakeholder participation in performance improvement, get the team in on improvement, and increase equipment and supplies reliably ready for every case. Move that to the right, secondary drivers. We're breaking this down into things that we can ultimately do on a daily basis for our staff, right? So the secondary drivers, and this is smaller, so I'm going to have to squint here, increase the clarity of values and objective by roles. So organize the roles and tell everybody who's doing what so they understand what their job is. You can't do your job if you don't know what it is, right? Obtain a future state for all roles and standardize those expectations. Increase the reliability of core staffing. You're not going to have good systems if you can't put people there reliably, right? So we have to fix our core staffing. And we're going to train for essential role integrity, which means we're going to train to the point where we don't have to take a step back every time somebody is sick. We have to develop more redundancy in our staffing than that. And we're going to obtain a baseline of understanding for performance excellence work, and that's a cultural thing. On the next step down, here's our metrics. Increase on-time starts, decrease turnover times, decrease preventable delays and cancellations, just like we talked about. Improve OR scheduling and staffing to support greater utilization of existing supply. So we had a little bit of a constriction problem, so we had to do better with what we had. Increase supply when demand is demonstrated. So we want to increase the supply, but only when we know we're going to use it. Right? So when demand is demonstrated, then let's make sure we have it available. Increase OR availability to match surgeon needs. And then down to the next one, understand market changes at the front line. Increase buy-in on understanding of all metrics. Increase staff management trust and facility awareness of the perioperative work in order to galvanize facility support. So get our bosses on board that this work is important. And then finally, in that category, improve proactive management work, increase CPD, sterile processing, ongoing trust and communication with the OR, cross staff influence. So because of, if you have those issues, one of the things you can do is have OR teams work in sterile processing when they're orienting and vice versa. If you work in sterile processing for a few days, I can tell you it'll give you a lot of sympathy for the challenges they go through. So we like to do that to cross-pollinate those cultural issues and get people from stopping to point fingers at one another. We also increase preference card maintenance so that we're picking the right items from the recipe and make sure that's driving good decisions. And then over to the right, you can keep going. Your actions are on a daily basis. Workflow reorg, pod leader development, which is your charge nurses. Frontline staff leading the reorganization work. Identifying essential roles and commit to 100% staffing of those roles. And then we talk about metrics and report on leadership, report out to our leadership reviews. So we get granular so that we can start to assign responsibilities to people, to leaders, to middle managers, and most importantly, to get frontline staff members involved. Because as leaders, we can do it all ourselves. No, we can't. But even if we tried, we're not going to be effective, right? We have to get the culture involved. And ideally, you have a situation where the team believes that they're doing the right work, and the manager can stay out of the fray enough to make strategic decisions instead of trying to do it all themselves. So this is, I presented this driver diagram for the Institute of Healthcare Improvement on their Patient Safety Executive course in 2013. And this was based on our real work. So I think that's the last slide. So you guys have gone all the way through it. Is there any questions?
I don't have a question, but I want to drive a couple things home that you said that we kind of got over in the class that I'm glad you brought up. First of all, is that if you do in medicine, if you do anything to the average, you'll be wrong 50% of the time, and that's a great thing to remember. So you'll see. I'll even put problems on tests sometimes. It'll say, it looks like this ER should be able to function just fine with this many rooms, but the answer is no, because there's peaks and valleys there that you have to account for. So I think it's, pick a number, whatever it is, but it can't be the average. It can be a standard deviation or two from the average, perhaps, but not the average. And the other thing that is just astounding, especially in the OR, probably almost more than anywhere else in medicine, it is astounding that anyone makes it through the process of, initiating the surgical, the pre-op, all the way through all the stuff that has to happen, all the way through the surgery. It's astounding. If you did process mapping for that process, it would be 30 pages long, probably, all the steps. So it really drives home how important it is to get as many of these individual steps correct. And, as Jason pointed out, things always sort of fall through, and you hope it's just the little things that are not of huge consequence. But that's where you come in, because the work that you do as process improvers and systems engineers are to make sure that as many of those steps as possible are efficient and accurately performed. So I just thought that was fascinating. It really struck me. How does anyone ever? How does a total joint ever get done? It's amazing to think of all the steps that have to happen, and yet it does all day, every day, all throughout the world and the United States. So it's great. Sorry, Brian, I saw your hand up. Sorry, I didn't mean to take up all your time.
Yeah, I just had a question. What, as you implement new technology, what has been the biggest disruption to, operating room functionality or, just these kind of workflows in general? I'd be curious.
So it was the question that with regard to technology, is there anything that has been improved?
It doesn't necessarily have to be technology, even I'm just kind of curious, like what kind of disruptions to these standardized workflows, maybe innovation or new demands, new procedures. So today I had a meeting with the Ambulatory Surgery Society, and I was in a roundtable, and we were talking about this issue. We were talking about the downward pressure on reimbursement and revenue, our ability to make money, and our staffing challenges, not to mention supply chain issues, right? So what you're coming up against is that you have a difficult time finding the right staff, which puts your processes at risk, which constricts your ability to do cases, which lowers your revenue, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so it's a concern for the future of our system that our labor costs are going up. Our deductibles, the average deductible is actually larger than the average reimbursement that the facility gets. And so that cost is being shifted to patients, and ultimately it's unsustainable. So we're in a bit of a bind in American healthcare, and we're going to have to figure it out at some point, because the quality is ultimately going to suffer. And so I don't know what the answer is to that question, but I know that there's a lot of us out there talking about it, and we're really hoping that we can figure this out. But it's going to take some fiscal discipline in order to solve some of these issues.
All right, thank you.
Sure. If you don't, I'm going to have to go in a minute, but if you don't mind, I'd like to make a quick plug. If any of you are really into this information, go research the human factors of error. So there's a field that deals with why people make mistakes and what systems contribute to their mistakes and trying to figure out how to prevent those. I just find it so interesting. And if you like this information, I think that will also be pretty interesting for you.
Quick comment, or you have to go.
No, please go ahead.
Kind of related to Brian's question too. I remember like during COVID when we had such a big demand for beds and more just flooded with patients needing to be admitted. A lot of procedures were canceled, and then it was hard. It was really difficult because we want, as a hospital, for financial reasons, we don't want to cancel all these procedures.
Right.
Because that's what we're getting out of our revenue. But then we didn't have the best for it. It was really kind of a phase of it. There was a lot of like inpatient, outpatient, inpatient and service struggle trying to find in that. And we're still kind of seeing that with this. I know they did cancel a lot of procedures around that time, and I think we're still pretty much focused on that. We're seeing a lot of now these cases that were canceled from a few years ago, now we try to catch up, and we're still kind of doing a lot of that struggle.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you probably very much involved in the support for that too.
Yeah, that was a rough time, and you may not be aware of this, but 80% of the revenue that a hospital makes comes from the operating room. So when you shut operating rooms down, it's like taking a baseball bat and hitting the hospital in the gut. So I'm sorry, I do have to go. I want to thank you all so much for allowing me this opportunity. It's been great. And if you want to reach out to me separately, I'm always willing to